If you can't fit the system, you're still pressured to fit in. Trying to fit in and failing gives you second-class citizenship, which is still considered better than to choose and commit to your othering and being cast into the dungeons. At least if you're a second-class citizen, you're still in the game, but that game is rigged against those who don't fit in to begin with. If you try and fail, that can be framed as a skill issue rather than a great injustice done to you by others of society. Gender roles used as victim-blaming propaganda to prevent rebellion. Queer people's reverse gender role expectations are used to other them, often without giving them the choice. They're compared to the opposite gender role of their usual or assigned one, but then are still made to fail at the game because being a gender non-conforming queer person is still considered lesser than the gender-conforming opposite sex. Like a butch lesbian doesn't get the same status as a straight man, but she will still be grouped as one of the lads in a lot of social contexts. The system inherently treats queer people as lesser than cishet people. We can simplify this aspect of the gender role system as a 4-quadrant matrix. On the top row, we have gender-conforming straight men and women, and below them we have gender-non-conforming gay men and women. The top row is the standard, the expectation you're assigned at birth, the thing you're supposed to be striving towards under gender roles. The good, the valuable, the correct, the desirable. The bottom row is the reverse expectations that have been generously allowed for those less gender fortunate who simply can't achieve the gender-conforming heights that lie above. If you can at all help it, you don't want to be this. If you really need to be, you may, but it is to be pitied and cringed at. It is not desirable, not valuable, not correct, not good. The logic being, if someone fails at their assigned gender role, they go vertically down as far as they need to, ideally stopping before they reach that gender non-conforming rock bottom. If they reach that rock bottom and still can't do it, then they might as well transition diagonally up to the opposite gender role, and maybe they'll be more successful at that. The concept of queer and gender non-conforming trans people, like myself, ruptures the system to its very core. The system believes that both gender conformity and transition happen not because those people inherently happen to prefer that form of gender, but because they couldn't be their assigned gender role properly and made do with the next best thing. That transition is an attempt to climb back up the social ladder from queer unacceptability to merely being better at the opposite birth sex's gender role than one's own. The idea that someone who is able to perform a decent version of their assigned gender role would still choose to transition diagonally down is unfathomable to this logic. It'd mean that not only is that rock bottom something desirable to these people, it is indeed more desirable to them than the gender-conforming height they could have had in their birth sex. They'd rather be doubly queer than the potential paragon of their assigned gender role, or at the very least a decent second-class citizen who doesn't deserve the dungeons or exile respectively. And there is no explanation for that other than that I guess this person's gender is actually that thing somehow. But that would imply that their gender isn't just the consequence of failure at their birth assignment, that instead it's an immutable part of their essence. And if that's the case, then does that mean that gender-conforming trans people and gender-non-conforming cis people are also just the gender they say they are instead of failures trying to do damage control? That transition is the treatment for a medical condition fully independent of gender role expectations like expression and sexuality, not an attempt at social climbing. Sacrilegious! Oppression and privilege can coexist. Privilege is the absence of further worries and disadvantages, but it doesn't cancel out existing ones. Being of X-privileged group doesn't mean not being oppressed, because if you're disadvantaged in one way, that is the case no matter what other privilege you may hold. Also, privilege and power are situational, not inherent at the end of the day. It comes down more to the situations you usually find yourself in and what patterns you may experience there based on a certain characteristic than about whether you have that characteristic to begin with. Not all people of one group have the same experiences because their circumstances vary. Like if you're a contemporary woman in the West working in a fairly mixed or female-dominated job environment, you won't have the same sexist struggles that women face in other parts of the world or in male-dominated jobs or in different areas of history. Or if you're diaspora, you will have a different experience to someone of your ethnicity or nationality who is still living in their country or region of origin. I think it can be more useful to group people by their general amount of disadvantage than only ever their specific identities. Not in the sense of Minority Olympics, because it's never going to be quantifiable like that, nor, again, Thus, being less oppressed than other people make you not oppressed at all. But there are hyper-privileged people who have no major disadvantages in their life. And there are hyper-marginalized people who have so many marginalized identities to worry about that they are spread way too thin. Most people lie somewhere in between those 2 points, but how much they have on their plate can vary greatly within that spectrum, and I think that is more relevant than what exactly those things are. Like, I find I get along better with, say, cis people of color than I do with cishet white people or non-binary people of color with other intersections, even though as far as labels go, we have less in common than I do with either of those other groups. Even the most disadvantaged parts of either gender role still have gender bias. For example, last year my mother was, I keep talking about my mom. Look, I talk to my mom a lot, okay? I talk to her every week. Shush, we are on good terms, it's good. Last year, my mother was trying to hire someone to help her with cleaning and fixing things around the house. When she put an ad up for both skills, she didn't get any responses. When she put up separate ads for a cleaner and a handy person, only women applied to the cleaner position and only men to the handy person one. She ended up finding a nice local lady who now helps her out with all of it, but she was still shocked at how stark the gender bias was within those responses. Gender roles prepare and train people for certain skills and activities due to the gender expectations, role models, and resources they grew up with. Those base gender role skills are often used in jobs with a low bar of entry, like construction work, cleaning, sex work, and so on, as opposed to ones that require certain qualifications or are otherwise less accessible to marginalized people than to their more privileged peers. Because of this, these jobs tend to be heavily dominated, if not near monopolized, by one gender role over the other. Construction grunt work is not only physically taxing but also quite dangerous, and construction workers are generally looked down upon by society. But it is also insanely male-dominated to the point that it is practically inaccessible to anyone who isn't a hypermasculine straight dude. I mean, I tried getting one singular high school level diploma worth of electrical skills, and I barely made it through a year of that because of the misogyny and transphobia from even the most well-meaning of my lads. Sex workers are plenty disadvantaged and persecuted as a profession, but their customer base is also almost exclusively male because men have less access to free sexual attention than women. Anyone willing to cater to men has the option to do sex work if they need to, meaning it is not a job option for the vast majority of straight men, while it is for the vast majority of women and queer people. The cis men most successful at online sex work are celebrities writing off their pre-existing fame, men-loving men, and femboy cross-dressers. Never mind the bitches gender fluid and on HRT, the femboys are out. It's only celebrities and men-loving men now. Every time I think I have a gender-confirming cis person example, every motherfucking time. We have talked about men being able to find professional success in female-dominated areas, but women similarly can also profit off their gender role advantages in male-dominated jobs. Female military spies are underestimated by their enemies, making them very effective at their job. Handy women, while few and far between, are more trusted in domestic spaces than their male counterparts, hence can make a shit ton of money being domestic electricians or plumbers or whatever, as one of my electrician teachers assured me, and I had to be like, that's great for them, but that doesn't apply to me, unfortunately. But there's a certain scrappiness that marginalized people, including the matriarchal in-group, have in the face of the lack of the relevant kind of privilege. So for women, that would be the lack of patriarchal privilege. That scrappiness is not privilege per se. It's more like the frantic guerrilla survival tactics of a hunted animal. It gives an advantage in the face of adversity, but it is not free of worry or effort. Like, God, I keep talking about Barbie movie. Look, I'm not gonna shut up about Barbie movie for a while, okay? You're just gonna have to deal with it. It was very fresh when I was writing this, okay? It's been so long and it just... Like the bit in Barbie movie where she's running away from the businessmen and she jumps over the gate while they stop and fumble for their keycards instead, wasting time while she gets away. Scrappy. Patriarchal privilege, among others, is having systems in place that work for you. You can use them to get what you want, so you default to doing things by the book. Cis men usually only don't do shit by the book if it's in a alternative or nefarious context, or if they're marginalized in another way that prevents them from it. Not having that privilege means you can't use these pre-existing systems. They don't work for you and don't enable you in the same way because they weren't built for you. Therefore, you learn to do things your own way by default, which tends to be harder, more complicated, and have less impact overall. Like, a woman can get a male-dominated job these days, but it's usually still less likely to be in a straightforward, you study it, you get the job, you get success and big money way, and more of a, the normal route in didn't work, so after the third back alley you tried, you managed to slip in through the back door and only made it up about half as far as your cis male colleagues before your energy gave out on you, kind of way. Plus, then there's the retention issue women face with being expected to be the primary caregiver of their children rather than stepping up to senior roles in their career. But, men are also taught to try and monetize and do everything professionally. Women are allowed to half-ass things and do them for fun, which then also prevents them from brute forcing something into a business the way men might, for better or for worse. This also extends to other more matriarchy-aligned parts of the matriarchal in-group, by which I don't mean woman-aligned or aligned that way by choice. Matriarchy merely retains a stronger grasp on those who have more traits in common with it, whether they like it or not, as previously established. Like, my friend recently sent me this weird ad for something called Boy Send Candles. The branding was using explicitly genderqueer language while not including the breadth of the associated genderqueer community, a decent portion of which would not be comfortable being referred to as boys or this into the color pink, because those are both very gendered things, which already raised some very red flags for me. We ended up figuring out that the brand was made by two cis gays seeking to represent their very specific cis male gay relationship to femininity, which, valid, but bitch, think before using words that don't only describe you and your very specific experience, God, and was successful enough to have articles written about it outside of queer community outlets to branch out into other products and be purchasable in actual stores. Industry success. If a trans mask had come up with the exact same idea, I can guarantee you it wouldn't have been more than a tiny obscure Etsy shop. As a quick note, I've been pointing out similarities between the female gender role and the experiences of the marginalized, and I will do some more of that in the next few videos, but that doesn't mean that the female gender role is as marginalized as them or that it is more marginalized than the male one because of these similarities. The male gender role also shares plenty of issues and experience with marginalized groups like the empathy gap, expendability, or a high suicide rate, but this series is about the female gender role, so we're focusing on that one for now. Gender roles bring good and bad things with them for those who fit into them. If you fit into the female gender role, you get a lot of privilege in the areas we've discussed so far in this series, but you also get the downsides that come with those areas and the interactions with the male gender role. Those downsides are what we call misogyny. Traditional woman or patriarchy-centered feminism focuses on misogyny as experienced by gender-conforming cis-het women. It ignores the good things women get from fitting into their gender role. It presents a highly limited woman victim, man oppressor narrative. It has historically failed the intersectional parts of the matriarchal in-group, and it has neglected to include men or encourage them in their own liberation, stunting gender liberation as a whole. If you don't fit in, you only get conditional privilege and extra disadvantage. Cis women prefer me talking about men's lib over the cis-het neckbeards, on the condition that there isn't a cis woman who could do it instead. Meanwhile, I still get misogyny from cis-het men the same as they do, plus the transphobia, the misgendering, and the misandry that I'm also affected by. There's also a difference between fitting into and having stuff in common with a group. Fitting in gets you the whole package deal of privileges. Sharing some but not all of its traits gives you partial privilege. This is different from conditional privilege because the characteristics in question aren't mutable or relative to other factors. Even if I'm not a cis woman, no one can deny my birth sex or my femininity or my attraction to men, or they look rather ridiculous trying. The effect of this is still limited, however, and you remain ranked lower within the relevant system. You do not get the package deal and you do not hold power within the in-group. Some discrimination happens to people of the matriarchal in-group, but only its intersectional or marginalized members, not privileged cis-het women. I don't think that kind of discrimination can be called misogyny because misogyny is the bad parts of fitting into the female gender role, so it would affect cis-het women the most severely, which this doesn't. For example, discrimination against AFAB drag performers and drag kings in favor of AMAB queens is not misogyny or transphobia. After all, there are trans women performers who find success just like their cis male peers. However, there is no real AFAB and or drag king equivalent, regardless of gender labels or trans status. Neither of the two cis women who wore on Dragula, nor Chio, who got Mr. Gaywall to be trans-inclusive by the sheer power of being hot, are as well known as Gigi Goody or Bosco, let alone getting to educate about their issues and experience to an audience as wide-reaching as that of RuPaul's Drag Race. Or discrimination against sex workers doesn't just happen to the most cis-het female ones among them. It's legislation, stigma, potential violence that affects all of them, and is compounded for those of them who have other marginalized identities, like being people of color, or lower class, disabled, trans, or queer people. I think we need a different word for that. Misogyny as a term, just like the feminism that focuses on it, traditionally centers mostly privileged cishet women, in presumption if not explicitly. This kind of discrimination affects people of the matriarchal in-group, not its patriarchal out-group, yes, but it's more about the intersections than their matriarchal status at the end of the day. Sex workers aren't discriminated against because they're women. It's because sex work, regardless of gender, is looked down upon because it's associated with the marginalized people who historically and to this day perform it. AFAB drag kings are not discriminated against because they're women. It's because the male gaze is obsessed with AMAP bodies like its own and the femininity it desires, so neither foreign AFAB bodies, even the transmasculine ones, nor its own masculinity interest it. And the patriarchy still controls mainstream media. It's once again the consequence of patriarchal narcissism and desire, not that of belonging to the matriarchal in-group. So do trans women, who lived as men for a significant portion of their life, profit of male privilege?
Being misgendered isn't privilege?
Which is the exact argument that immediately derails any productive discussion around this subject. People treat you how they perceive you. The Wachowskis wouldn't have been able to make The Matrix if they'd entered industry as women or even just visibly queer people. Source me, a femme-out trans person who has tried for the past 2 years now to get into that same motherfucking industry like 30 years later to little to no avail despite my ungodly stubbornness and prior media experience. The reasons I wasn't able to last and the few jobs and training opportunities I managed to get my grubby little hands on during that time were always explicitly to do with my gender or trans status. I mean, I couldn't even finish like half of them because of it. I quit electrician class a year early, as mentioned before. I used a cold as a convenient excuse to not have to attend the second half of some virtual production training I had signed up for last year. I had to quit my last job after a week, even though the contract was meant to last for 4 months. Whether it's lad-only spaces grinding my nerves to dust with casual misogyny they don't even notice half the time, or companies unwilling to commit to the bare minimum of public trans allyship necessary to retain the diverse talent they hire. What's the point of me wasting my energy like this when I can just retrain and actually get a stable job that pays me in a different sector? It's not like I need media industry to create things. Thank the internet lords for enabling me and every other marginalized artist out there to self-publish these days. Where would we be without it? The reason the Wachowskis were able to have the career they made for themselves is because they did not face those same barriers to entry, because they were perceived as cishet men at the time. Or, I get to generally feel safe in the women's bathroom. That is a privilege I still enjoy and that I am grateful for while it lasts. A lot of other trans people and androgynous women don't get to take that safety for granted in the same way. Is it the case because I'm getting misgendered by every stranger who sees me in there? Yes, absolutely, but that's a separate issue, isn't it? This derailing problem can be circumvented by saying matriarchal and patriarchal privilege rather than female and male privilege in relevant contexts. It describes the systems of power, not the people affected, which helps not take it as personally. It doesn't assume the gender of the people involved, which makes it easier to talk about without misgendering oneself or others. People shutting down because they feel accused or would have to misgender themselves to talk about their experiences isn't helpful, after all. It's easier to get kicked out of the fortress than to escape the ivory tower. The masculine ego is paranoid. It has no tolerance for traitors and sees parts of itself as detachable. Its numbers are expendable for the sake of the fortress at large. You have to conform or you're out. The feminine ego is self-assured. It can't fathom a traitor in its midst. It knows you in and out. How could you possibly know yourself or anything for that matter better than it does? Come back to bed, hun. You're just confused. We'd never do something as cruel as kick you out. We'll just treat you like shit for the rest of your life. But you can stay, don't worry. Both are doing the sexism to themselves once again. Treating men and AMAP people as dangerous and expendable, and treating women and AFAB people as dismissible and stupid. Also, as discussed, womanhood has more ways to achieve it convincingly than manhood, and it's normalized for cis women to wear men's clothes, unlike the other way around. This means trans femmes have an easier time passing than trans mascs, but they're also at a higher risk of harassment and violence when clocked as trans. People don't know what trans masks look like enough to clock them as, this is a trans person. They'll just assume they're a weird-looking cis person of whichever gender they see them as.
But harassment risk is worse, though. At least if you're being misgendered as a girl, you're safe!
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought being misgendered wasn't privilege. Or does that not apply anymore when it's not about a woman? Also, at least in my case, me being safe from cishet male aggression, unlike a lot of trans femmes, seems to have little to do with what gender I'm perceived as, and more with the fact that I am tiny, look like this, and my arms are made of spaghetti. I am not a threat to cishet men's masculinity. I am a cute little monkey that can do tricks for them and says funny things sometimes. The TERFs don't consider me a threat, the lads don't consider me a threat. We'll just have to see how much I can get away with before they start seeing me as the threat that I very much am. Cis women struggle more, or at least more noticeably, with trans people coming out and transitioning. I think this is largely due to the core matriarchal idea of body and identity being linked. So AFAB people leaving that identity behind and AMAB people trying to claim it doesn't really work for them. Mothers of trans masks often struggle with their offspring's medical transition even if they're supportive. Mothers are more invested in their notably AFAB offspring's body and gender identity. They have a strong physical bond with their children because they're the parent who carried the baby and breastfed it. They're more involved in their upbringing due to being the main parental authority, and they identify with their AFAB offspring as the expected matriarchal heir, same as men do with the AMAB line. Therefore, they're more affected by their offspring seeking to change that body and identity. It is a disruption of their held beliefs, not their decision, hence outside of their control, and it represents a loss of sameness that puts a distance between them and their child. They will often insist on being involved in their child's transition, like by caring for them after surgery. My mom came all the way over here from Luxembourg when I had top surgery, and I've heard plenty of other cases of mothers insisting on being involved in surgery aftercare as well. It gives them the means to gently regain control and involvement in their offspring's new body, and lets them affirm their matriarchal authority via the power area of care. Less supportive cis female loved ones often struggle with trans women coming out. They may define their own womanhood exclusively via the bad experiences they've had as cis women. Misogyny, sexism, sexual assault, pain, suffering, and sacrifice related to periods, pregnancy, and motherhood. They can't understand how someone who hasn't had those experiences can claim an identity that to them hinges on them, as notably early transition trans women will still lack a lot of real-life experience living as women. Kinda gotta come out first, innit? Trans women, on the other hand, see womanhood as something affirming, or at the very least an escape from a worse place, rather than something defined through suffering alone. And they have plenty of gender-based suffering of their own to show for, even if it's not in the same ways that cis women experience. Growing up queer in AMAB is generally not a walk in the park. They're about to face oppression as trans people for the rest of their life. And I mean, most people's dysphoria alone could measure up to the required amount of suffering. Cis women are also more prone to transphobic, "you're just doing it because blank" arguments than men. They might insist that trans femmes are caricaturing femininity or just transitioning to get men. Harold, they're lesbians! Meanwhile, trans masks are apparently transitioning because being a woman is too hard. Wait. Like, why can't you just be butch? I tried, hun. It didn't work. I'm already way ahead of you, don't worry. These are based in internalized misogyny and matriarchal superiority and lead to contradictory logic and in-group oppression. The female gender role requires X of women, so if you don't do X well enough, you can't possibly be a real woman. But also the female gender role is bad, because feminism. Trying to achieve or partake in or cater to X is to be shamed. And even if you're not trying to do X, you'll still be accused of it. Being a woman sucks to the point of wanting to give up your very identity to try and escape. But also matriarchal power and a unicentric and misandrous worldview are to be viciously defended at all costs. Men want to be women and appropriate woman things, but women couldn't possibly want to be men, and appropriating man things is unfeminist, lest done by a woman. We are so good and healthy in our brains right now. This logic makes total sense and is not wildly crazy. Just to reiterate, no one subjects themselves to transition and all it entails for anyone other than themselves and their own comfort. Like, I cannot fucking stress this enough. Like, it's okay to be gay these days. If it was only about getting laid or even building a happy life with a partner, you would not need to transition for that. And misogyny doesn't go away for trans masks, notably if you're anything other than a passing hypermask binary trans guy. Transition only adds misgendering, transphobia, and misandry to it. Having a disadvantage in one system doesn't automatically give you privilege in the other. Even if you manage to escape your assigned gender role, that doesn't mean the other one will take you in. Most non-binary and non-passing trans people exist in a sort of no man's land between the two, left behind by a society that doesn't know what to do with us. We don't get the structure and support that gender roles provide. There is no proper guide or direction to orient ourselves by. Women are put in charge of people's comfort, pleasure, physical and emotional well-being, and children. They hold power over people in their most vulnerable states. With great power comes great responsibility, yet women aren't taught about theirs, unlike men. We teach boys that they hold power as men, that they need to be careful with it if they don't want to hurt others or themselves, that ideally they should use it to help those less fortunate, as a moral duty, not just out of pity or kindness. Chivalry. We teach girls to be polite and gentle and pretty and caring, but not that they hold power in those things, including the power to hurt people. We don't acknowledge matriarchal power as power, leaving girls unaware, not empowered, and without the tools to consciously choose responsibility and wield their power safely, as an honorable moral choice to feel good about and affirm their gender with. This is why feminism traditionally focuses on patriarchal power and abuse but doesn't hesitate in its own. Women are literally not aware enough of their own power and damage potential to realize it could be a problem. Just how men don't realize how emotionally starved they are. So far, we've looked at where matriarchal power lies. Now let's look at how it can be abused.